All right, I guess we'll get started on session 2. We're going to move in and turn our attention now to basically the conflict that exists between Israel and the Palestinians. The challenge, obviously, is it's way more complicated than anyone could imagine, which is why it's never been solved. On one hand, it is, and on the other hand, it's not. But I think you're going to see that it is complicated for various reasons that most of the general public doesn't know about. The solution, it actually sounds simple. Well, just split them up into 2 states and let them live their lives and separately and go on living life, right? And so, but why hasn't it happened? This is where a lot of finger pointing often takes place, and a lot of our media points the finger at Israel. And so in this session, I want to bring our attention to how complicated things are, and pull back the curtain to see the reason why a 2-state solution hasn't happened, and honestly, to help you see why a lot of it falls on the lap more of the Palestinians than Israel, which is not what is commonly portrayed today. One of the things I was kind of surprised to find out is that the Jewish people have always lived in the Promised Land. Again, there's always a remnant. Like when the countries would come in, they would leave, and they conquer Israel, they'd leave some of the Jews there. And they certainly have always been the minority, okay? They have always been a minority since that time. I had the impression, though, that prior to 1948, everyone around there were Arabs, and the Palestinians lived there, and Israel comes in, the Jewish people come in, they push them all out of the area, and that's not what happened at all. So I want to back up into a little history, and let's start off first about a little bit of history about the land and the name Palestine. In AD 70, when the Romans squashed the Jewish rebellion because the Jews rose up and tried to throw off the Roman oppression, the Rome squashed them. They came in and they renamed the area Palestina, which we call Palestine. They did this to literally take away the Jewish identity with the land because it was called Judea. And it was very much connected to the Jews. So they renamed it. And the interesting thing is that the name Palestine comes from, remember there was a people group back in the time of David known as the Philistines. You might know the story of David and Goliath. Goliath was a Philistine. Listen, the Philistines, here's what's interesting. They weren't Arabic people. They were actually connected much closer to the Greeks than anybody else. And so what does that mean? Well, it means this: the modern day Palestinians are not Philistines. They're not Greeks. They're Arabic people. And which is what the land was named after, was the Philistines. The history gets a little bit more crazy in that all during the time since Judea was renamed Palestine, the term Palestinian included Christians, it included Jews, and it included Muslims. It simply is a reference to people living in the land. It's like saying like this: if I live in Chicago, I'm a Chicagoan, right? It's not showing you anything about my ethnicity or who I am as a person. It just shows you I live in the land. That's all that Palestinian was for the people at that time. It was a term used to describe where they lived. If they were to talk about themselves as a person, the Jews would talk about themselves being as Jews. The Arabs would talk about themselves either being Arabs or Muslims. The Christians would talk about themselves being as Christians. So Palestinian was just a term used to describe where they live. In fact, what's even more crazy is that prior to 1948, if you were to read a story in the international press talking about the Palestinians, it was more likely to be talking about a Jewish person than it was an Arab person. And so without spending more time than I have on all of that, it's just an interesting thing how over a short period of time the terminology has changed and become different than what it really was even being used back then. And so the Arabs believed that the area of Palestine should be part of southern Syria, not a separate state. They weren't even trying to take over Palestine. They wanted the land, but they wanted the land for southern Syria. That changed when southern Syria collapsed. and they turned now to defending Palestine for themselves. That's when they started taking on the name Palestinian. Now, again, I've oversimplified a short period of history in a few moments of time, but the main point is that the Palestinian people are Arab people. They're literally no distinct ethnic group known as Palestinians. And again, that's not to put them down, it's just truth. Like, there is no ethnic group of Palestinians. Their ethnicity is Arabs. They are Arabs. And that doesn't mean they're not important. They're not any less important. They're people. They're loved by God, but it needs to be considered in light of the conflict that we're talking about. That there is not a separate group known as Palestinians, they're actually Arabs. Now, within that, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that matters coming up, but within that is this idea of refugee status, which I think needs to be at least explored and talked about. The refugee status of the Palestinian people is complicated as well, just like everything else in this region is. It's also pretty one-sided, as many Jews became refugees, and you never hear about them. Let's start with the narrative. The narrative is that when Israel became a nation in 1948, they took away the land from the Palestinian people, they displaced them, and now there's a bunch of Palestinians who are refugees. Certainly were some cases where that happened, but quite honestly, where most of their displacement happened, it was for military reasons. And it was for the protection of the Israelite army, and it was actually for the protection of the Palestinian people to be displaced from those areas. But that's not all that was going on. There's more to it. The truth is a lot of the Palestinians left their homes in anticipation that war was coming their way. So they just got up and left. They weren't just getting out of danger either, because what was happening, and this is, again, there's documented cases of people admitting this was going on, of Arab leaders admitting this was going on. The Arab countries around were convincing the Arabs that were living in the land, get out of the way because our armies are going to come in and we don't want you to be harmed. So we're going to come in, we're going to destroy Israel, and when we're done, you can come back home and you can have the land. That was their intention. They fully intended to come back to their homes after the Arab states around them wiped Israel out. Problem is that didn't happen, right? They didn't realize that Israel would be able to do the impossible, really, which, if you know anything, it was impossible. It was only a God thing, because God is a covenant-keeping God who actually was able to push the Arab nations out and win that war. And so most of the Arab Palestinians left willingly, thinking Israel would be wiped out. Interesting is the Jewish leaders actually were saying, hey, stay in your houses. And as we're becoming a nation, we want you to stay and be part of that nation. But most left and the war ensued, and so it didn't work out. But even after the nation of Israel was being careful and trying to keep peace with their neighbors in the land, they did certain things. One of the things they did was, and I think I might have put this in your notes, but the Jewish forces seized, like this is an example, Tiberias on April 19th, 1948. The entire Arab population of 6,000 was evacuated under British military supervision. The Jewish Community Council issued a statement afterwards. We did not dispossess them. They themselves chose to leave. They chose. Let no citizen touch their property. But the point is that they would go around and they wouldn't let you touch their property because they wanted them to come back, actually. And so they wouldn't let them touch their property. They were very careful that they didn't just take and grab all the property that the Arabs left behind. The main point is Israel didn't cause, though, the refugee crisis. The Arab leaders did. And they didn't intend for it to be a refugee crisis. They intended them to win the war. It became a refugee crisis when they lost the war and they failed to wipe Israel out. And no one, though, wants to talk about the fact that the Palestinian Arabs, though, when they were displaced, had these 22 countries to move to. Little is said about the Jews, who were then beginning to be expelled from all of these Arab countries they've lived in their whole lives. Those countries were saying, get out. And they only had one place to go, Israel. And the number of Jews, this was what's interesting, the number of Jews fleeing Arab countries into Israel following Israel's independence was roughly equal to the number of Arabs leaving the area of Palestine. So there was almost like a swap going on. Listen, the UN, they had over 100 resolutions into the Middle East referring to the refugees and the refugee status, and not once were they referring to the Jewish refugees. It was always the Palestinian ones. Many Jews, when they were expelled, all they could take was the shirts on their backs. They couldn't take any of their possessions. They lost their houses, their homes, their livelihood, and then they went to Israel, and yet they didn't remain refugees. Of the 820,000 Jewish refugees, 586,000 were resettled into Israel at Israel's own expense. Arab governments never gave them anything. This is why, and you may have hear this come up from time to time, but Israel will not compensate the Palestinian refugees. They've willingly said they would, only on the basis that, okay, we're going to compensate your refugees, you need to compensate our refugees. And the Palestinians refuse, or all the Arab states refuse to compensate the displacement of those Jews, so they are not willing to give the refugees compensation. To this day, the Arab states have refused to pay anything. And the contrast, though, again, is the different scenarios. Israel, the Jewish people are coming from 100 and how many countries, traveling hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles, not knowing the language, and coming to the small, tiny little country. And for the Arabs, their displacement, to be honest, most of them never left Palestine. They travel a few miles away to the other side of the truce line, and they remain inside vast Arab nations that were linguistically, culturally, and ethnically the same as they are. And so it's interesting. But refugee is supposed to also be a temporary status. So once you're acclimated into a new country, you're no longer a refugee anymore. But the Palestinians, the number of refugees keeps growing, and the status is being passed down to their children. By the end of 2010, the number of Palestinian refugees on their rolls had risen to nearly 5 million, which is several times the number that left in 1948. Just the past year, their numbers grew by 8%. But here's the kicker. 42% of the refugees live in Palestinian territory. And if you add the Transjordan area, which is actually considered part of Palestine, Israel took back some of that land in one of the wars, then 80% of Palestinians currently live in Palestine. But they're refugees. And so this popular image that Palestinians are in this place and have no land is actually inflated for sure. Less than 1/3 of the Palestinians actually live in a camp that's set up. So here's the thing, though. If you were to treat the Palestinians like every other people group who are refugees, the numbers will be quite lower of how many refugees there are. Even with the Palestinian Authority and their percentage of how many people are 72, which would be the age they would be if they were just infants in 1948. That means that there would be about 5,600 to 10,500 refugees still today. But the numbers probably be a lot smaller even than that. That's just being generous. So I think it's really important to talk about that because, again, the world paints a picture. There's all of these refugees. And it's not painting a picture that is rooted in a lot of reality. It's inflated in the numbers. It's creating its own storyline. But it's not actually, I mean, first of all, when you have to treat this people group differently in refugee status than you do any other people group, you know there's something wrong there, right? But I also would say, remember, there's something spiritual going on here. There's a spiritual dynamic going on here. So what I want to do is kind of walk through some key events. I've included this timeline in your packets. We're not going to look at all of these things, but I wanted you to have the whole timeline, that even that's just a snapshot of Israel's history. We're going to highlight a few of those things throughout here, but it'd take forever to go through their timeline and their history. But it's really important to start seeing Israel's history and what they've gone through and what they're facing. And I want to point out some things because I want us to know some of these things, because they paint a picture of really what's at stake here, what's going on. So first of all, again, no, the two-state solution sounds good. At least 4 times it was proposed and close to happening, and every single time the Palestinians rejected it. You'll see that throughout here as we get in here. I've highlighted some in yellow on your sheets that we're going to kind of look at. So we're going to look at them kind of together. 1929, there's what's known as the Hebron Massacre. 1930, there's the Arab Revolt, leading to 1936, the Peel Commission, and leading to 1939, what's known as the White Paper. And what I wanted you to see in this time period, okay, Israel became a nation in 1948. So this is before 1948. What I want you to see is that there has been tension between the Arab people and the Jewish communities long before they became a nation. They didn't have any right to the land at this point. They weren't controlling anything. And yet there is this persecution, oppression, and tension happening to Israel, really on the idea that the British started recognizing the Jews should have their own land, and it should be here. And so the British responded to the violence and the attacks against the Jews. You know how they responded? By trying to appease the Arabs.
Of course.
And they began limiting the amount of Jewish people that could immigrate into the land. They started limiting the property the Jews could actually own. They also played a huge role in basically the Holocaust happening, because the Jewish people had no place to go because they shut off immigration from this land. And so they were a direct, really facilitator of so many more Jews going to the furnaces and things, and the Holocaust happening. The conflict was so great that the only way forward was a two-state solution, which was recommended for the first time in 1936 with the Peel Commission. And so I wanted you to just kind of see that this conflict didn't start because they became a nation. Like, that's kind of the narrative, right? Well, Israel got land, so the Palestinians are upset about that. No, this is going on long before they even became a nation. And so if we look down into 1947, the UN Resolution 181, I have a map. I know it's not the best because it's kind of narrow, but I want to point it out to you.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
During this time, is Palestine one of the British
Yes.
colonies, or I don't know what they call it. They call it something.
The British
Territory?
were overseeing that territory. And that was actually brought up in between the class session. So throughout the whole history of Israel, or Palestine, whatever you want to call it, when Rome had renamed Palestine, there are no other countries that were there and that were like, this is our country. They're always overseen by another country. This is this part of the land. Part of that was, again, it was desolate. It was a desert. Nobody wanted that land. But they still had controlling entities. And so at this point in time, the British are overseeing this land, and they're the ones that are kind of patrolling it and taking care of it. Throughout their history, I believe the Turks were over it for a while. There's different people groups or different organizations or countries or nations that were overseeing the land, but there was never another country over that land.
In all this and all these past wars with Israel going way back, we could see Satan's plan. That he will always want to destroy Israel. And because if he could destroy Israel, then the word of God is not true.
Yeah.
And it's so important for the church to see, because a lot of this too is prophetic.
Yes.
Gathering the people back, and in 1948, Israel became a nation, and God has a word about that. He says, when you see Israel blossom again, that generation will see the coming of the Lord. We better shout about this.
Yes.
Because we can even see at the last hour now, all this is happening in the world. You said 60% are against Israel. Satan has a plan to get the majority of the people against Israel, so no one helps Israel in the next major war coming.
Well, and let me be careful to make sure you understand that statistic. That was Gen Z. It's every generation that gets older has higher support for Israel. The younger you get, the less support you see.
Yeah.
And it shows you that, it really shows you what our culture is doing to our young people. Where the older people know, they have a little bit more history, they know what's at stake here, and the younger people just, that's why I say it's so much of it's grounded in ignorance and what's being taught.
Demonic.
It is. What I want you to see is the UN partition plan. This is 1947 to a two-state solution. You can see the blue is where the Jewish state would be, the green is where the Arab state, and then Jerusalem would be under international control. That was the idea that was proposed. What's interesting is the Jewish people, in a way, you look at it and they get more land than the Arabs, and that kind of became the talking point. And but it's not really a true statement, because what you would find out if you really start isolating that is, first of all, look at that right there. Israel's land is indefensible. There's no way to defend that country against outsiders. It's not even fair. But second, all of the major cities are in the green. And outside of like Tel Aviv and Haifa, there is no other major city because it's all desert. So their land mass is actually not a better deal at all. Because the Palestinians are getting the central of the country where all the people were living anyways, and all the major cities were. And yet, under all of this, the Palestinians rejected this plan. This shows you kind of all the cities, the major cities that the Palestinians were going to get. And so that is what was being offered right out of the gate, and the Palestinians rejected it. In 1948, Israel, declared their independence, and May 14th, 1948, they became a nation. And one thing I want to highlight here is during that time, Israel becomes a nation. They had this war, they win. Not all the Palestinian Arabs left. The ones that stayed became part of the population of the newly formed Israeli government. They became citizens. On top of that, they're part of the government and full citizens to this day. There are Arab Palestinians living in Israel throughout the land. There's 2 million of them. There's 9 million Israelis, and 2 million of them are Arab Palestinians who live in the land. And contrast that to the fact that there are 0 Jews living in Palestinian land. They couldn't live there because they would have been killed, and they're not safe to live there. But 2 million Palestinian citizens are living right next door, and their neighbors, they're in government, they're in the education system, they're all throughout the land, and they're full citizens in Israel. That just, to me, shows you, again, that narrative. Because how many of you knew there are 2 million Palestinians living in Israel? Most of us probably didn't know. I might have known some of them because I think I've heard reports, but I didn't know it was that high. Now, of course, that's still a minority, but 2 million is quite a bit.
And they're
No,
not harassed or anything?
They're not harassed.
No, sorry.
No, not at all. And so I think that's really, really important for you to see at the birth of the nation. Israel was being truthful and saying, hey, if you want to stay, we want you here. They weren't getting the same treatment, though, in these Arab nations, and they would not get the same treatment in the Palestinian nation. The Jewish people would be expelled from there because they don't want Israel to exist. In 1964, there was the creation of the PLO, or Palestinian Liberation Organization. And I just wanted to point out, PLO only exists since 1964. That's not very far ago. And they came into existence in part to form a Palestinian state with the full intention of destroying Israel. Just like Hamas, in their charters, their charter says they don't want to acknowledge Israel exists. They want to destroy Israel.
That's right.
And nobody wants to really acknowledge it, even though you can go on the internet and find it and see it right in plain sight. And I only want to point out on the 6-Day War that the Arab states once again started a war with Israel, and it resulted in Israel victory. And when Israel won that, guess what? That's why they captured key areas. That's why they captured East Jerusalem and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula, is because they started a war with them. The result of that war was they took over these areas. Why? They took over those areas because they became parts that were a security threat to their survival. And they really just policed those areas. That's really what they were doing in that. Now, in 1979, Bill Clinton was really on the verge of thinking like, hey, we're going to finally have a two-state solution. And so we have the Camp David Accords. And once again, a two-state solution was proposed. And again, this is hard to see, but it looks like this. And you could see Israel has given up quite a bit of the central land to, it's primarily Gaza and the West Bank. All of that is being given up and proposed, and it looked really good, like it was going to happen. And at the last second, guess who dropped out and rejected it? Like, no way.
It's never enough.
Then we moved to the 1993 Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords, Israel signed these agreements. They basically signed these agreements. They said, we'll negotiate the border disputes, and if we can't give you the land that you want, we'll trade you for other land. You know, we'll make it right. And this is what created the Palestinian Authority. But there was a breakdown in talks that happened when their Israeli prime minister was assassinated, and then all of these terrorist attacks started happening to Israel. And so you can imagine when you start getting attacked, you're not talking about peace anymore, right?
Right.
And that's what happened. This is under the Oslo Accords, and this began, really, the plan was this, and this still is majorly part of the plan, and that is to start giving the Palestinians some authority over themselves, but not full authority. Let's see how they do before we give them full authority and autonomy over us. And so you can see that there are certain areas where the Palestinians have full civil and security control, then there's other areas where the Palestinians have Israeli Palestinian control, and then there's full Israeli civil and security control. That's why you see the different colors on the map. And it really was just tests to see how they would start doing under their own authority. And you can imagine they didn't do so well because they rejected this. They wouldn't even do this. They wouldn't even start making a pathway forward. In 2005, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip. What's one of the narratives today? Israel's an oppressor, right? And if Israel just gave land to the Palestinians, there would be peace.
No.
Well, they tried that. It didn't work. All that allowed was terrorist groups to form and launch attacks into Israel from closer range. And what's stated before, but people don't seem to hear, is Israel doesn't want to occupy Palestinian land, but they also can't afford to be attacked by it and these terrorist groups that form there. One person put it this way, and this was one of the people in the Israeli military. He said, if Hamas laid down its weapons, there would be no more war. But if Israel laid down its weapons, there'd be no more Israel.
That's right. Exactly right.
That is what they face every day in this land. 2007, Hamas takes control of Gaza. And here's another thing that most people don't realize. The Palestinian leadership is divided. In Gaza, Hamas is in control. In the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority is in control. I mean, think about this. How do you have a country where your leadership can't even be the same? And they're not even on the same page. They can't even get along with themselves, let alone control a nation.
Right.
And they're acting like two separate nations now. So what is there supposed to be a three-state solution to kind of deal with this? It's just one of those things where, again, a lot of people don't hear that and know that. They just think Palestinians, but the Palestinians are divided. They have two different groups controlling them in different parts of the country, and so they're not even on the same page. In 2007, there was another conference that was rejected. And again, once again, Israel's willing to give up land and disputed lands under question, and once again, it's rejected. You can move into, I'm not going to highlight it, but Trump had a plan that the Palestinians wouldn't even hear. Part of the reason why I was going to skip that is I feel like I understand why they rejected that plan. They weren't even involved in the plan. Like, the Palestinian people weren't even at the table talking about it. So they rejected it outright. They didn't even want to sit down at the table and hear what the plan was. In some ways, though, like I said, I kind of get that. At least let us have a seat at the table. And then let's see what we come up with. But I don't think that would have changed anything, knowing the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So then we turn to October 7th and the Hamas massacre. This is where we're at today. And this is why, again, it bothers me that there's this growing sense in our country that Israel's the aggressor and should stop the war. Yet over and over they find themselves just defending themselves to exist. And this is what you see in their history. Over and over, they're not the aggressor. Over and over, they're constantly defending themselves just to exist. And they're finding ways to do that as best as possible. So their history is not just about October 7th. Their whole existence is really every day they wake up and they could be attacked.
Yes, right.
I met with a few people over the course of the year who were from Israel. I talked to a guy whose brother is over there, and he was serving in the military, and he's injured from going in and trying to root out Hamas. And he got hit by the aftershocks of a mortar explosion. So he has a lot of damage in his own that he's recovering from. But every day, can you imagine, this is how you exist. Every day, sirens can go off. You have 1 minute to get into a bomb shelter. And this is their existence.
That's right.
On almost a daily basis. And yet, you want to know what's interesting? The Israelis are more happy than Americans. Americans rank at like 14 on the happy list in the world. Like, we're not even happy, and we have so much. And the Israelis are like 4. One of the most happiest places to be. What I want you to see is, like, a lot of things that have happened in the land has been an appeasement for the Arabs, and thinking if we appease them, everything will be good. And it just never pans out. They're not a people that are appeased. they'll act like they will be. Land for peace. We just want that. Well, they give it to them, and then next thing you know it, one of the guys that I was talking to, who was Jewish, he said when we gave them Gaza, it had all the greenhouses, the land was fertile. And what they did was they took all of that land and they dug up all those pipes to make bombs out of them to throw into Israel. Like they destroyed their land because destroying Israel was more important, even though they had the infrastructure given to them when they pulled out of the land there.
Yeah, one thing that Israel hasn't learned yet, you can't make a deal with Satan.
True.
All he wants, if he says, well, we'll go this far with land, he's not gonna be satisfied until he pushes them to the sea.
Yeah.
And the world don't understand that. You know, church doesn't really understand that right now. But I think that the true church understands it.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of funny is that it's almost like they don't look at their history. And in the past, the kings would go into the temple and grab all the gold and say, here, protect me. Use it as for protection, but they didn't help them.
No.
You know, you would think that they would not continue to say, here, take this land.
That's true. Let me talk a little bit about October 7th, though. Israel was attacked, but it wasn't an attack on its military. It was an attack on its citizens, and they tried to wipe them out and leave the remaining citizens living in this constant fear. When's another attack coming? Like that was their goal. That's the goal of terrorism, right? I mean, I think we should have learned that at 9/11. Was the goal of terrorism wasn't just to inflict harm on a certain people, it was to disrupt the whole way of life for a whole country. And that's what they were after. October 7th ruined entire communities and decimated much of Israel's infrastructure. It destroyed up to 80 or 70% of Israel's agricultural production. When was that ever talked about in the news? About all the impact that Israel took, besides just the 1,200 people that were killed. I read one report where, and it's actually in this book, but there's a report where this is a reporter who goes into one of the communities that was decimated shortly after October 7th. And he's in a military escort, and they're going into the city, and on every house where there was somebody who was killed, they spray painted a red dot. And he said there was not one house that didn't have a dot on it. But then the soldier went on to tell a story of what really took place on that day. He said, well, what one of the people did, one of the terrorists did, was they went into a house, they killed the parents, and there was an infant that was crying. And anytime somebody heard that infant crying and would try to rescue that infant, they would just shoot them. They used the infant as bait to murder more people who were trying. So to kind of think like, I don't understand how you can be pro-Hamas and say that this is justified when you actually know what they did. The only way you can say that is you don't know what they did. These were barbarians who were demon possessed, could I say?
Yeah.
There's only one way of doing stuff like that, I think. And they went in and did this. How would you respond if this was your family or your community that was attacked? Is there any way you could justify the attackers if this was personal to you? There's absolutely no way. And so one of the ideas, though, that is thrown out in our media today is well, Israel's committing genocide. Well, do you know what the definition of genocide is? It was actually created to really describe what happened to Israel in the Holocaust. Genocide occurs when a government intentionally targets a people group for extinction. That's exactly what Hamas was doing. Targeting a people group for extinction towards Israel and what was seen in action on October 7th. It's actually what their charter is, to wipe out the nation of Israel. It's genocide. But the flip side of this is Israel's made it very clear, even in the media, that what is their intention? It's to go after and wipe out Hamas, right? It's not to wipe out the Palestinian people. It's to completely destroy Hamas, a terrorist group. And guess what? As a sovereign nation that's been attacked, they have every right to defend themselves and go to war on their enemies that attack them. But get this, Israeli forces that go into Gaza to weed out Hamas, they create these safe zones to relocate people while they search that area. They do this at great risk to their own army. They walk through urban war zones, unable to tell who's a terrorist and who's just a Palestinian person that's innocent walking around here. They've sent food and water at their own expense to help the people that they're being accused of trying to wipe out with genocide. Not to mention already, we said 2 million Arab Palestinians already live in Israel. So if they're committing genocide, they're really bad at it. Because they're really not doing a good job. The truth is they have no intention on wiping out the Palestinian people group. They have every intention of wiping out Hamas, though. And of course, innocent Palestinians are dying as part of the casualty of war, and that's the sad nature of war. But even at that, the media does something to try to spin us against Israel, because what do? They put up on the screen how many Palestinians have died versus how many Israelis have died, and the numbers aren't even close. For example, if you Google it, 35,000 Palestinians have been killed and only 15,000 Israelis. And so I want to touch on a few things about these numbers, because numbers do lie in a way. And they don't give us a picture of the full truth. The second is this: the number does not separate the terrorists from the civilians. And there's no way to do that, for us to do that at least, which is very important, right? I mean, because if you kill 30,000 Hamas terrorists, well, that was your goal. And that suddenly is way different than 12,000. Because think about this. Out of those 12,000, the majority of those were innocent civilians, not Israeli soldiers. And they do have a distinction between the two numbers. The third is the fact that the authorities of Palestine are constantly putting their own people in harm's way. Israel will drop leaflets saying, hey, we're going to bomb this area, get out. And the leaders will force the people to stay. And in essence, the leadership will drive up the death toll. I know it's hard to wrap our minds around, but they don't care about their own people.
That's right.
And part of Islam actually teaches, like, there's an honor to die for this fight we have against Israel. And so some of these people actually take it as a badge of honor, like they're honoring their religion to do this. And so to place the blame on Israel is not always fair, especially when terrorists are willing to place their own people in harm's way. They intentionally place their weapons near hospitals, businesses, and people's homes. And furthermore, it's been noted, and you might have even saw this story, one of the hospitals got blown up and destroyed, and they reported on it all day long about the rockets that fired, and Israel must have been, but when they found out that Israel wasn't to blame, and that it was Hamas who misfired and shot their own hospital and blew it up, guess what? The news stopped reporting on it. Quickly became not a major story. And so the media is good as long as it can blame Israel. But listen, and the Palestinians knew it was their own that blew up their hospital, but they were going to milk it for all it was worth. And all that to say, again, is Israel has a right to defend themselves. I would say this: if you look at their military, they're even more disciplined than the American military is. Remember, we were attacked on September 11th. What did we do? We went and took down 2 countries. That's how, I mean, we thought through the plan, but that's what we did. We went and we took out 2 countries. Israel could easily wipe out Gaza if they wanted to, but instead, they're only targeting the terrorists. I don't think we realize the impact that October 7th had on Israel. 2,000 people killed that day, another 250 hostages. 36 of those who were killed were infants. The metropolitan area of Chicago is 9.5 million people. It's bigger than Israel as a whole country. And that day, pretty much everyone knew somebody who was affected by this. And if they didn't know somebody, they knew somebody who knew somebody that was affected by this tragedy. Just think about New York. You hear that, right? You hear that when people in the city, everyone knew somebody who knew somebody at least that was impacted by that horrible event. And so this was a major blow to this nation that impacted them, and all they're doing is defending themselves, and they're constantly getting told,
That's right.
you need to stop the war. You need to stop the war. But we didn't start it. Go
I have
ahead.
a couple quick comments. Scripture says that Israel will be abandoned by every nation. And as we see that happening, including the United States, I think that's because God will not allow anybody to take credit for Israel except himself.
Right.
Amen.
And then the second thing I wanted to say was, and this is probably just trivial, but the Arab word Hamas means bravery, but the Hebrew word Hamas means violence.
That's right.
All right, I'm going to wrap things up unless there's any questions. This book is really a lot more about the timeline since October 7th, but it goes through some of the conflict in the history as well. But it's mostly about the current issues that are going on. This book is definitely about Israel's history. This gave me a lot of insights on like Israel always was in the land, just kind of some of the accords and the peace processes that went through, filled with a ton of things. This is actually a friend of mine's sister that I know, and this is a great book that really just talks about the relationship, a lot about the conflict and the relationship between Israel and Palestine. She does a really good job about talking about Israel being the covenant people of God and why that's important. And a lot of the information I talk about covenants, but also about caring about Israel, but not rejecting Palestinians. And most Israelis really separate the two. They really want there to be a peaceful solution, and they want to coexist. Most Israelis will say that, and they mean it. And then this one was really dealing more on this concept of Zionism, because Zionism is a bad word today. But it really goes through the history of Israel and why Zionism was important and is still important. And so I don't know if any of those help, but those are kind of an overview of these books in particular. Yes?
Yeah, you mentioned how each Arab country is really, they hate one another. And the only thing that holds them back from war, they all have one goal: destroy Israel.
Mhm.
That's why we don't see them turning on one another, because they all have the same mission. And they know that they all have to be in agreement with that to destroy Israel.
You know what, though? That's a little even complicated, too, because I didn't really touch on it, but there was, trying to remember, the Jordan-Israel Peace Treaty in 1994. And there's been some subsequent happens, I think, during the Trump era, where there was some opportunities that were given their way to start having this trade happen between these nations around them. It has brought peace to the region, and there has been a little bit more, but it hasn't dissolved that hatred. They just realize we can make money and help each other, and they're willing to do that. But it has opened up a pathway with some of these, like Jordan in particular, that has been beneficial to the region, has helped stabilize the region. But there certainly is, and I didn't really talk about this either, but there are a lot of those Arab nations who don't want the Palestinians in there, because the Palestinians have come into some nations and they've been expelled because they start forming terrorist groups, and they don't want them there. So they're kind of, in a lot of ways, have made them not appealing to these other Arab nations to even bring them in. And again, I don't want to have too broad of a stroke on a people group, because the goal is not to just say they're bad, But in the Israeli conflict, there's a lot more going on there. And remember, Palestinians did vote Hamas in. They haven't had a chance to vote them out, but they voted them in, for sure. So, as a wrap up, why should we care about Israel? Well, I hope that first session you see they matter to God, and Israel should matter to us. I hope that I've been able to show you the spiritual side of things are the most important reason. Again, Ephesians 6:12, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. We know like there's a spiritual warfare battle going on against Israel. I think as Christians, we have to have the spiritual eyes to see behind the hatred that people have towards Israel. It's sad to see that most of the world has turned away from letting what happened to the Jews during the era of Hitler, which we said we never would, right? Like we'll let that happen again. And now all of a sudden the world has so much anti-Semitism today where it could happen again. And how do we get that? Well, Satan hates the Jewish people. They're so special to God, just like he hates us when we're saved. There's like a target on our back often. There's a target on the Jewish people's back because they're set apart for God. And I think we should care about Israel because we see the spiritual battle that they're up against. And we're called to intercede and to pray for those who are being persecuted. Hebrews 13:3, continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. And if we take that seriously, that our job is to take and go, okay, Israel is being targeted, they're suffering. Well, as believers, I'm supposed to pray for them and feel that way. I'm to remember them and go through life with that. And so my prayer is that this class has really helped us understand that we should care about Israel and in a greater way than maybe we have. But I also hope that, again, we see the truth behind their history and we can see the patterns that are often not clear to us today because they're not being taught or told. And so that we understand, well, why would I side with the Palestinians when so many people are? But again, I'm hoping that we love Israel and we love the Palestinians. In fact, many of our neighbors are Palestinians. And both Carrie and I are praying that they might know the love of God. Like we believe, like, we've had houses go up for sale and we're like, God, just give us the neighbors you want us to have. Well, if I prayed that God would give me the neighbors I need, they're the perfect neighbors. And I need to be praying that, we're missionaries to them. We're called to be missionaries to them.
Right now, there's a great revival in Afghanistan. And that's the perfect example because we could pray that revival spreads.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Even
our
in
hope.
Pakistan.
Yes.
There's a pastor in Morris that goes to Pakistan and is doing big crusades and just people getting healed, saved, delivered.
Well, here's the last verse, because at the end of the day, I think we have to look forward to this promise. Revelation 7:9. After this I looked, and there was a vast multitude from every tribe, nation, people, and language, which no one could number, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. And they were clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands. And so every nation, every tribe, every people, every language, we're standing before the Lamb. Can you imagine what a wonderful day that will be? No more war, no more hate, just the awesome presence of the Lamb and us all worshiping in unity together. And that is the culmination. Jews, Palestinians, Gentiles, whatever we are, all together worshiping at the Lamb's throne. And I think if there's anything that's our prayer, that's our desire, that's what we want to see. But that is, I think, the perfect place to end.